Hi. So, Phyllis Wheatley, her story begins inside of 1761, whenever she would have been about 7 or 8 years old. She was brought from Africa as a slave, and there's not a lot about her story that we know before then. She was bought by a man named John Wheatley for his wife Savannah, or Susanna, sorry, Susanna, to be her companion, to be her friend and caretaker during her older age. Susanna had a lot of compassion for Miss Phyllis Wheatley because she was so frail, but she was extremely intelligent. Um, at this time in history, as most of you all know, it was not common for females to be taught, to be given any sort of education. And the Wheatleys really took Phyllis in, and their daughter Mary taught Phyllis how to read and write, and taught her how to speak English. John Wheatley wrote a letter to an editor about how quickly she had learned English and how uh, intelligent she was, and how she had learned by being curious about reading and writing. Um, and by 1765, she had had writings that were published throughout America and in England. Um, she was also learning many other languages, such as Latin, and the Wheatleys were in a very influential circle in Boston. They lived on King Street, um, which is where all those intellectual people, all the influential people of the colonial America seem to be from. Um, and their Christian values began to be challenged about keeping slaves, and how this Christianity lifestyle was challenging the slavery lifestyle. Her writings were inspired by this challenge, by Christianity. She was especially inspired by George Whitfield, and she wrote a poem about his death, and it became one of her most famous poems. And it was published again throughout America and England. She was considered a child prodigy by a lot of people. Her works began to appear in New England and to spread throughout the world. Her admirers saw her as an inspiration and a triumph over this oppression that was throughout America. And she was a picture of what America was thought to be, this intelligence, this devotion to God, her very artistry and writing. So Wheatley eventually goes to England in order to uh, help her health, to get better health, but also to get support to publish her book. She had faced a lot of uh, rejection because she was African American, because she was a slave. A lot of people did not believe that she had wrote these poems herself. But while she was in England in 1773, an admirer of Wheatley's did arrange for her works to be published. She never saw them published in England because Susanna Wheatley had gotten very sick, and they traveled back to America. A year later, Susanna dies in 1774. John Wheatley died 4 years later, but in between that time, we know that Phyllis Wheatley had gotten her freedom, that she had gained her freedom. Uh, because the same year that John Wheatley passed, Phyllis Wheatley marries a man named John Peters, and they were both listed as free African Americans. But we really don't know anything much else about John Peters, except that he may have been a questionable character. He may have had a lot of debts, but a lot of those sources are kind of questionable themselves. So we kind of always say that. But we know that the two of them, in their very early years of marriage in Boston, did fairly okay. But then they were run out of the city, and in their moving, they encountered a lot of debt. Phyllis has 3 children, and 2 of those children had died. And on her deathbed, her third child lay very sick right beside of her. Um, and they actually passed away very close to each other. They were both buried in an unmarked grave side by side. Uh, So it is speculated that she had another work that was about to come out, another volume of her work, but she never officially had this happen during her lifetime. Her husband probably published some of her works in order to pay off his debts after Phillis Wheatley had died. But Phillis Wheatley began some major traditions. She was the first African American slave to publish uh, literature, to publish poetry. So she was the first African American poet. And she kind of sums up the American Revolution a little bit uh, inside of one of her poems. And she says, "On every human breast, God implemented a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance." So, thank you guys.